You're listening to The Invisible Addiction, a podcast series investigating problem gambling in the UK. In this episode, I speak with Matt Gaskell, Clinical Lead and Consultant Psychologist for the NHS Northern Gambling Service. I wanted to find out about the treatment that clinics provide and hear Matt's views on the landscape of the gambling industry. How do we define a gambling addiction? What help do the NHS clinics provide? And how can we make gambling safer in the future? Matt is a fantastic human being, doing amazing things for so many people affected by gambling. You can follow him on Twitter and also follow the NHS Northern Gambling Clinics. I'll leave links in the description. Finally, if you haven't already, do check out theinvisibleaddiction.com with links to podcasts, vlogs, blog posts, and more importantly, support networks in the UK for people struggling with gambling problems. Without further ado, here is the conversation between Matt and I. Enjoy. Hi Matt, how are you doing? Thanks for joining us for today's interview.
Yeah, it's a complete pleasure. I really enjoy engaging with people with lived experience. They take their time to engage with me, and it's a privilege to give a little bit back.
It's very kind of you to give up your time for today, and so I suppose really I just wanted to kind of pick your brains about gambling, about your experience, about what you do, perhaps some thoughts on where we can go in the future with things. So I suppose a good place to start would be, just maybe talking a little bit about your background experience. Maybe you could just, for a minute or two, just tell the listeners, about what you do, really.
So I lead the NHS Northern Gambling Service. So we have three actual treatment centres, recovery centres in Manchester, Leeds and Sunderland. But they're regional services, regional sites. So we understand not everybody can travel and get to there. So we also do some outreach and we provide remote consultation as well. It's important to say that as well as dealing with the individual gambler who may be struggling, we also provide a separate service to affected family members or partners, people who are just struggling with somebody else's addiction. And we tend to work with the more, in terms of the gamblers, we tend to deal with people who've got more significant problems. So we are dealing with, if you think about a continuum of harm, we're dealing with people who would be categorized as having, if you like your labels, people who've got gambling disorder, quite significant gambling disorder. And, not always, but often they come with co-occurring difficulties. So that's where we specialize.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm a psychologist by training. I'm a consultant psychologist. I lead addictions for the NHS Trust that I work in. I've been in addictions for a long time now. It's my sort of passion, and I'm fascinated by it, and I love working with the population as well. I really do. And I'm really keen to do my little bit and try and make a difference, but also to advocate for wider change as well, to support and protect our communities.
Fantastic. There's a lot of questions that have sprung up in my mind there. So I suppose as I'm trying to get this as much as an essay that I would write at university, where the introduction would always start with a definition. Could you, in the best possible way, could you define what a problem gambler is? Or you mentioned about the people that you see that are most at risk. Can we define a gambling addiction or problem gambling?
There isn't one agreed definition, but we could talk about some things that would be common in any way of thinking about it. So we're obviously dealing with a behaviour. This is something that people do. We're not frogs that stick our tongues out automatically when a fly swats past. So we're dealing with a reward-seeking behaviour, which is excessive. That there's a sense of a loss of control, and where harm ensues. So it's a repeated behavior where there's a loss of control, where it has negative consequences. Usually those negative consequences are stacking up as time goes on. And the perplexing thing for us is that the behavior continues despite those negative consequences. And that's the thing that's fascinating, isn't it, for everybody? Why did I continue this behavior when it was, it's really starting to harm my life? And others looking in can be perplexed by it. It's also probably worthwhile pointing out that another marker would be that when you're trying to make an attempt to cut down, control, or stop the behavior, that you tend to have difficulty doing so, even when you make firm resolutions to do that. So those are some of the things that I would consider in a definition. I'm not great on some of the labels and the language that's used in this area. We've got to be super mindful not to stigmatize and blame individuals. So yeah, we struggle with the language, I think, that we use, and there's different opinions on that. But yeah, I would say that I think there's a couple of other things I would mention too, that gambling harm is on a continuum. So yes, we often talk about this term addiction, which is folks who are at the higher end of the scale. 85% of the gambling harm that occurs underneath those labels of addiction or problem gambler. So the volume of people who sit under there vastly outweigh the numbers at the very top end of the scale. But interestingly, everybody's worried about prevalence and the numbers. There was a recent YouGov survey just a couple of weeks ago, which revealed that there's 1.4 million people with gambling disorder in this country, and you compare that to 580,000 people with alcohol dependence, for example. It gives you some idea of the the amount of harm that goes on that the public is largely unaware of.
No, sure. I mean, I saw recently that. Sorry, if anyone's listening, there's a drill in the background, and it's highly distracting. I hope this is not coming out on the recording, but I shall try and gather my thoughts. But yeah, I mean, we can cut this bit out, Matt. Sorry, so distracting.
I can't hear anything at my end, so I hope for you that it works out.
Sorry, I'm just trying to collect my thoughts of where to go with this. But I mean, you mentioned about the individuals there, and certainly in my case, it very much felt it was all pinned on me, my own sort of conscience of like, this is my fault actually. And when you see the adverts, when the fun stop. It's very much put on the individual to, for the individual responsibility. Interestingly, I had a conversation with a trained hypnotherapist, and we spoke about getting to the root of the problem. And one of his mantras, or one thing that he would say to people, would be that he said, "It's not your fault." And that, I think, for me, that was very powerful. So, I mean, what can be done, I suppose, to change this this perception? Because I think ultimately what I'm trying to do on this channel and this podcast and blog is just trying to kind of raise awareness, but also to take the stigma away from gambling, because it can very much be. I remember in the community, for example, my mum, I'm not blaming my mum, but anyone that would be known as a gambler was like known to be quite perhaps connotations of someone who is maybe a weak person, and it was connotations of, I don't know, it just wasn't very nice. So so what do you think can be done to change this opinion?
The first thing to do, which it's great to hear that you've got to this point. The first thing is to identify that individualizing this is really harmful. So putting the burden of blame and onto the individual is just wholly wrong, inaccurate. It's an untruth, and it needs to be challenged wherever you can do it. And we've all got to be careful about this. Individuals who, take that that blame on. They lose their self-respect. They can start to loathe themselves. It can be really risky in terms of making them feel suicidal and add to the burden of the problems that they're having. It removes very, very cleverly this idea of responsible gambling and focusing on faulty individuals. It's a very clever, sophisticated approach perpetuated by the gambling industry to avoid attention where attention needs to be paid, which is to the commercial practices of the industry and their addictive products and their methods. It's all part of a carefully constructed approach by big industries that we used to have, and we still have, with tobacco and alcohol and others. This is a responsibility that needs to be shared. When you're formulating and trying to understand gambling, you can't do it without a focus on the commercial environment that the behavior exists within. It's just not possible. So, professionals have to be very careful too. Psychiatrists, psychologists, we're trained to focus on individuals. We're trained to sort of, listen and get into the minds of individuals and find clues and try and understand the behavior. But, to understand this behavior, you have to broaden this out to the commercial environment and understand how that operates, and how, we are in an era now where the gambling industry has expanded exponentially since the Gambling Act. We're in an era of technology and the shift from land-based to technology and the ease of access and availability. We're in an environment of very light touch regulation. We're in an era of mass normalization. The advertising is everywhere. It's online. The way that it works these days, that people are targeted, young people particularly, which is a huge change from when I was young. When I was young, gambling was done seemingly behind closed doors. You just couldn't even see into the venues. There were frosted windows at bookmakers and so on. And mostly gambling was what I'd consider a discontinuous activity, where you might bet on a couple of horses on a Saturday afternoon, but you weren't continually preoccupied and focused and frequently betting and gambling like you are with today's casino games and with the amount of sort of horse and dog racing and virtual racing that goes on. So what I would say is first of all, we've got to recognize the wider determinants of harm. This isn't, you might consider the individual, you might consider their environment, their development, but you have to also look much more broadly at the commercial environment and their practices, including promotions, VIP schemes, adverts, but also wider society as well. What's happening to us all as individuals as we're growing up, and the stresses, the pressures on young people, what's expected of us, and sometimes the need for escape that we all have as well, to get away. I'm not talking just about what people might consider mental health problems. I'm just talking generally about society, the way it's constructed, the fragmentation of our society, and how we tend to be drawn to some of these other behaviors to just get away from life sometimes.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I appreciate gambling can be that you can get into that bubble of wanting to get away. And again, after the conversation that I had with the hypnotherapist Yoni, he sort of said, well, maybe subliminally there was something there that that I was trying to get away from.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that nobody grows up wanting to have a gambling problem. It comes back to that. I haven't met a single person that thought, this is exactly where I wanted to end up. This has been my goal. So something has happened along the way. It's usually a very gradual, insidious process. People don't, necessarily start gambling and then it's 100 miles an hour all day on the first day. It tends to be a process that people don't even recognize how far they've got into it, and don't recognize the depths of the difficulties that are arising, and until it's quite late. And so I think it's really important that all professionals who are engaged around this, as well as people with lived experience, understand the wider determinants of harm, and education and and treatment and support help people understand that, so that that responsibility that ultimately people take. So individuals do have some responsibility, and that ultimately they take that responsibility, as you've done, to change and courageously do that. But that has to be shared by a responsible environment that that protects people.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems that the Gambling Act is well out of date. 2005. As I say, was
before smartphones, before
yeah,
it all went online.
yeah,
There's more reference to postal, to the post, than there is to online. And yeah, I mean, it's difficult to convey how much the environment has changed. The mass advertising, the ease and availability, and the lack of regulation and protection, and just how embedded it's got in our groups and in our society. In different age groups as well, older age as well as young men and women growing up who see gambling as the adverts portray, which is, this is a very fun, engaging, entertaining leisure activity. And the harms are hidden. They're hidden from the public. People have no idea about the addictive nature of products, or the way that this normalization can engender attitudes and fondness for particular brands and particular ways of doing things. And it's very, very easy for young and vulnerable people to fall into this. I mean, it's worth saying, as we always have to do, that for a lot of people this is a fun and engaging activity, but I do think there's a real difference between this and alcohol, drug misuse and so on, where the public have a much greater awareness of the harms. I think we have a long way to go with gambling before people really get that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, sorry, as always, so much to say, so much to think about and ponder. So I mean, the thing for me, I think, gambling is so broad. In my own instance, it was the casinos, it was roulette, blackjack. But of course, gambling is so broad. You're talking like horse racing, like you say, bingo, which is another, a big one that you see a lot of on the TV.
They're not all the same.
Not all the same. So,
and it's broad. I agree with you, and I think the public are not aware of this as well. And we've got to be careful too that we don't necessarily brand this as a one size fits all. I think the difficulty that we've got is that we have got a range of products which are fast, intensive, immersive, where you can bet very frequently over short periods of time, where you don't have the opportunity to step out and reflect, where you can just be drawn into this other world without really being aware of your surroundings. You can lose time. And it's not just the products. So there's particular products like that which have got certain characteristics. We call them things like event frequency, bet frequency, speed of play, and so on. But also where you yourself create an environment where you can be betting on multiple things and remain gambling for a prolonged period of time. So you could have multiple accounts open on where you're looking at, you've got different things on the go, different games on the go. You could be in a bookmaker's betting on horses and dogs and virtual racing all at the same time. So you're constantly in play, frequently betting, frequently renewing and thinking about the next bet, without any time for reflection. So I mean, that just gives you a little bit of an idea. Whereas something like, say, the National Lottery, once or twice a week, is discontinuous. It's fairly benign. I'm not saying it's completely harm-free, but we're not going to get referrals into our clinics for the National Lottery because it doesn't contain the same addictive characteristics that other forms of gambling do.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I saw recently was, like, for example, Australia. They've banned TV adverts between, I think, 5:30 in the morning and 8:30 at night. And they were saying that people as young as 6, or children as young as 6, were able to identify brands, right, are able to identify betting odds and stuff like that. So I don't know if am I safe to ask what you think what can be done? Obviously, to in the future. I know Matt Zarb cousin has done a lot of work, campaign for fairer gambling and the new campaign of clean up gambling. So yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are about that and the future.
Yeah, I mean, the question really is, where do you begin? Because there's so much, and there's so many opinions on this. It's very, very tricky to say concisely. I would say that we need a comprehensive new gambling act that really contains a comprehensive review. First of all, we need a significant change to advertising, promotions, VIP schemes, sports sponsorship. So I'd see, a huge change there, as we've had with tobacco. I mean, tobacco used to be, amongst sports and other things, and it no longer is. There's a question as to whether you could have adverts on in the early hours, for example, away from children, but children need to be completely protected away and not see images of gambling in sports or on the television or online. So a huge change there. There needs to be changes to addictive products. In terms of accessibility, ease of accessibility. Game design can be amended and can be altered in order to make them less addictive. There could be categorization of addictive products to give the public a greater idea of the harms. I'd consider having an ombudsman and a fair system for people to complain. At the moment, there seems to be a real injustice there. I'd think about some kind of national affordability approach where you potentially, I mean, there's different ways of doing this, but you can have some sort of national membership scheme that would cover both online and land-based, where you make pre-commitments linked to affordability. So this is the amount I can stake every month and that I can afford, and those are my mandatory limits. That would protect consumers. Of course, you can have higher limits if you can afford that, and you have a higher income. It's not to put barriers in place for those that can afford. The majority of people are on a modest income. It disproportionately affects, people who are on, more modest incomes. I would stop VIP schemes and inducements, free bets, all of these things which I think are rather egregious and harmful practices that the industry have. So yeah, I mean, those are a few things. I could go on, but
yeah.
For example, in Australia, they don't have casino games online. They don't have.
Were they not? No, I didn't know that. No.
They don't have in-play betting online. So the online space is particularly tricky in that people are gambling in isolation on their own. We don't know if they're drinking as well or what else is going on in their life. Just yesterday I asked on Twitter, if people could give me an idea of what interventions they'd had by industry, operators or staff in land-based venues. And, everything that came back said, I've been gambling for years and years. I've not had anything at all.
Yeah.
Or there might be the odd, message of, are you happy with your gambling? And so that to me is just not good enough. I think gambling has to be based on the principle of affordability, that people should not get into a position where they are gambling more than they want to on things that they didn't intend to gamble on, and they're losing more money than they can afford. So however you do it, and there's different opinions on this, I respect that. And not everybody's going to, agree with some of the things that I said. As long as that principle is adhered to and it's set in stone as a red line, then we start to get somewhere. Studies around the world are estimating that around 30% of industry revenue is coming from problem gambling.
Wow.
So there's a huge pushback and reluctance from industry for regulation. Pushback on, the VIP schemes were amended recently, but of course they're not stopped because, I think at the House of Lords committee recently, GVC admitted around 35%, 40% of their income comes from, 1.5% of their consumers who are on VIP schemes.
Oh my God! Sorry, sorry, you said GVC. Sorry, really stupid question. Who are GVC? Is that a company? Is that an acronym there? Or?
Yeah, so they're operators who have Ladbrokes and Coral, for example.
Okay, right. Wow, Jesus.
So big operators, some of the bigger names.
Yeah. 30%.
Yeah, I mean, they also admitted that the CEO admitted at the committee that 99% of gambling accounts are all losing accounts. You know, are consumers, are punters aware of that? Are they aware that the other 1%, if you get an edge, you're likely to have your account suspended or slowed down or severely restricted? So I think the other thing that's never mentioned too is that I'm not so sure we're on a fair level playing field where consumers are fully aware of what's happening, what the environment is, what the tactics are, how you're kind of pulled into this, and how unjust and unfair it is. You know, it can be difficult to withdraw funds. We know that as well. The reverse withdrawal function. You know, we could just go on and on all day about things that need attention to make it a level, fair playing field for people, and where they're adequately protected.
Yeah, no, just going off that thought. I mean, I've got a friend who is into horse racing, and he's very good. He's as you mentioned, he probably falls into the 1% of people that do win. And he said, I think pretty much every account but bar one has been closed down because he is essentially taking money off the bookmakers. And the fact that you've just mentioned that 99% of accounts are losing account, I mean, it's just like, I'm just shaking my head. It's just preposterous.
Yeah. And then obviously the longer you gamble as well, the more you're going to lose. You know, these are sort of, truths that need to just be out there so people can at least be much more informed of what's going on. But at the same time, the casual punter, the casual bettor, that's all okay. We don't want to be restricting that too much, but just as we're doing with COVID at the moment, for example, we might think that only a small percentage of the population are going to be severely harmed by COVID, but we're doing everything we can to protect them, aren't we? We're all in it. It's worth the effort to apply what we call the precautionary principle, where we move this to protect the group of people who are going to be harmed by this harmful commodity and environment, whilst appreciating that a greater number of people are going to be able to casually bet and enjoy that. But we just need to shift it and get the right balance. We're way off, Alex, at the moment.
No, of course, Matt. Well, are you okay for maybe one more question? Yeah. Well, I'm like, the pressure. I've got to make it a good one. You've been such a fountain of knowledge and source of great information. So thank you so far. But what's pleasing. We had a separate telephone conversation last week or so, and it was really pleasing to hear that you mentioned that there was going to be 15 new gambling clinics opening up in this country. Which is good news, and it does feel good that that after conversations like we're having, the stuff that that you're doing and others are doing on social media and whatnot, other charity that I really feel strongly about is Gambling with Lives. There's numerous. That's very close to my heart, given a suicide in the local community or two. So there's an emotional interest in this and social, political, whatever. So it feels good that stuff is being done. And you mentioned that people are listening, because in the government and whatnot. So, I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on about that. How can I frame a question? I don't think it is a question. I think it's just a point to make. But I think it's just good to know that we're having these conversations and hopefully driving change. I think that's the ultimate goal.
It's really important that people come together on this issue across the country. So whether it's lived experience, I mean, the lived experience voice is really coming on more and more, and it's absolutely fantastic. So I've tried to embrace this ever since we started designing the clinics. We've involved lived experience. We continue to do so. That voice is so important for change, because they're lived testimonies of just incredible harm and trauma that people have been through, and the courage that it's taken them to rebuild their lives. Clinicians as well, that very few clinicians speak out about this, hardly any. We need to do more. There need to be more people speaking out.
Matt, is that because of the they feel danger to maybe loss of job, or is it because it's political, do you think?
It's difficult to say. It's not really my place to speak on behalf of other people, but we ought to be aware that how the industry have been able to get to the point where they're sort of directing a lot of things that maybe they ought not to have a place at the table with. So research being one. So why should the majority of research in the UK be funded by the gambling industry, where that research has such a narrow focus, where vested interests will never be questioned? It continues the status quo. Education, you sort of think, well, great, we've got this education, but should we have, gambling industry funded education? Would we have the tobacco industry funding, going into our schools and talking to our children? Or would that feel better if it was independent and it was free of any any conflicts of interest there? So yeah, I mean, there's always the possibility that what's happening is it buys silence. Industry funding buys silence, and it takes attention away, whether that's through the education. And I don't know. I've not been to these education sessions, but there's the danger that some of the education sessions could have a narrower focus, so that it doesn't bite the hand that feeds. Research as well, very problematic, very difficult to get independent funding, but the industry is dictating. And so I think, my own point of view is that this environment would be much better if there was a funding position where there was a mandatory levy, or a taxation system through government where the industry were taxed, and it was a hypothecated tax. And either direction of that funding, that money goes through the government out into an independent council for research, education, treatment, prevention, public health as well. It's all independent. I think that would help everybody if that was the case. But to go back to your point, yes, there are people in government who are listening, and that's great. There's been a recent House of Lords committee that they're writing their reports. There's the APPG. They're busy writing their next reports as well. They have influence. But we also need to be aware that the industry are very sophisticated, very powerful. They lobby very heavily, and they're in the corridors of power as well, and very influential. So we all need to come together. Often there's differences of opinion in this area, and people can get split, but which is unfortunate, but we all need to come together who want to advocate for change and take on those vested interests.
That's fantastic. I feel if I could just squeeze one more question out of you, because I feel it seems foolish of me to not actually ask you about the NHS clinics and what you do in them and the support that you give and that you offer.
So you're right. We're in the next 2 to 3 years, the NHS is expanding its reach across the country, so to every major region in the country. So the 3 that we've got in North are really the first phase of that expansion. We've got good coverage in London and around the southeast with the national clinic there. So that's going to expand, and we need to look at how it fits into the wider infrastructure and make that a lot clearer for everybody. Where the NHS sits, where the third sector sits, where rehab sits, where education sits, and how we all collaborate and work together. So in terms of what we do, it's difficult to say concisely, but so we're all behaviour change specialists. We're all professionals, psychologists, therapists, and so on. And we not all gamblers are not the same, so it's important that they get have an opportunity to have a thorough conversation where we understand their gambling and the context and the development of it. We understand where they want to get to, and we collaborate on that together. We're equal partners. It's important that we look to develop their motivation and their confidence that they can do it. And we give them the tools and skills to address the behaviour. So there's programs to address the addiction itself, and there's quite a bit of work to do there. But equally, it's so important to move somebody away from the behaviour and to build their life and see that they can achieve their goals. They can live out their values that are important to them. They can reconstruct, if need be, relationships and engage with meaningful relationships with other people, with employment, education, activities, leading their own good life, really, and also building a recovery community around that, so that people are surrounded continually through that journey with people who have recovered, are recovering, where they've got those role models and they've got those mentors as well as the professionals. And then also that we help them into the wider society, that their local community, and embed themselves, with their families, with their loved ones, to see that they can outgrow this. This isn't just focusing on the addiction; it's also learning how to develop and grow as a human being and reach your potential. The one thing I have to say that strikes me, every time I assess somebody, even though they might feel that they're sort of a little bit down and out at the time, these people have so much potential, so much life to live, so many strengths about them, that it's also about just helping draw that out of them, that they have got, there is hope, there is optimism, there are clear strengths there. So there's quite a bit of that. We also specialise if they have co-occurring difficulties. So sometimes there are people who come with emotional difficulties, with difficulties managing and regulating emotions. People might have more long-standing other difficulties or mental health problems as well. So we're able to do that. We're able to do that under one house. They don't have to go and sit on a waiting list somewhere else for 6 months or so whilst we figure it all out. So yeah, there's a number of things that we do. We treat the individual as a holistic person, and we flex our offer to that person, really. And as I said at the outset, we deal with affected others and family members as well as a standalone intervention as well. So, and once we've graduated, whether that's a family member or a gambler, from our active treatment, we put them into a 12-month aftercare offer where they'll continue to be in recovery groups and be mentored and be able to have access to a professional. And if they get into a real high-risk moment or situation, they can get direct access via telephone coaching as well. So even if they've been months abstinent, for example, and they just find themselves highly vulnerable, feeling like they're not going to be able to control an urge, or they might have even had a slip, they can get in touch with us and be coached out of that moment and back on track. So we're trying to evolve our model and work with partners and stakeholders to do what we can. But I think it's important to say that we want people to move from the professional involvement with us to learning that they can, they've got the resources to manage this as well themselves, and with help of their loved ones and others. So we want to move people on and move people forward as well, and reduce the professional involvement as time unfolds. So I don't know whether that makes any sense.
Oh no, yeah.
There's quite a lot that we do. It's difficult to be concise and about it.
No, I mean, I'm for the listeners. I'm sort of just sat here, kind of staring at the screen, kind of nodding and just absorbing. And at one moment, I was getting a tad emotional. It was just hearing about that. You saying about that there is potential to lead a new life, and there's new opportunities will present themselves. And I think it's just, and this is for free, right? This is NHS. This is free treatment.
Free at point of use. Absolutely, yes. So you get access to, to all of these different things and activities, and you can negotiate it with us as well. It's all free of charge. And I think the emotional bit is what you were mentioning before. If we, when we're thinking about the hope that there is and the optimism that there is for people, and the way that lives can be turned around and individuals turn their lives around, we're also mindful of those who haven't been able to do that, and how gambling can consume people to the point where they can't see that hope anymore. And the Gambling with Lives charity have been absolutely wonderful and amazing and courageous in what they've been able to do, and because those young men and women had all of that as well. They had all of those strengths, they had all of those qualities about them, and yet this harmful commodity and this environment can really consume people, and they lose themselves completely to the point where they can't see a way out, and they lose control and decision making and autonomy and so on, and feel that life is never going to get any better. So we also remember them and are mindful of how serious this environment is and this work is that we're all in, and how passionate we all are to create change, so that those kind of outcomes are significantly minimized. Arising out of these awful tragedies, hopefully, is the greatest respect we can pay to those families is to be 100% passionate about change and making sure that these kind of things don't happen to other families.
I think, Matt, I think that's a great place to end, actually, and finish on. I think that's a fantastic note. Bit taken aback there, but I think that's the main aim, isn't it? That hopefully, if someone's listening to this, just one person, if we can just make a difference, that's the main aim.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. I think just come forward. There's a variety of different support, not just on the NHS, with the third sector, with Gamblers Anonymous. And the important thing is to come forward and just have informal conversations. It's not some sort of weird, mysterious place with people with lab coats who are going to look down on you. You'll meet a human being who will listen, will understand, will not shame you, will not judge you, and will help you move your life forward. And we can be really optimistic if they can come forward that we can do that. The outcomes are pretty good. It's taking that first step that's the all important bit. You may remember, it's just acknowledging that there's a problem, talking to a loved one about it, admitting that there's something, and the relief that you get from doing that and from engaging with loved ones or with a professional is the first most important step.
Absolutely.
So we hope if we reach one person with this, that would be worthwhile, Alex. It's time well spent between us.
No, nice one, Matt. That's a nice one. Is there anything at all? I mean, I feel like I could probably sit here for another couple of hours and speak to you. But is there anything at all that you would like to mention that you've not talked about, or is there anything else that you want to speak about just before we go? Or have I run you out of all your your energy? Yeah.
Oh no, definitely not. This is a subject you could keep me talking about all day, but no, I just thank you for reaching out, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about, and maybe one day we'll get a chance to do that and come back for some more. So the door's always open.
Who knows? That's absolutely fantastic. I would absolutely love that. So thanks once again, Matt, and I'll speak to you soon.
My pleasure.
It was a real pleasure talking to Matt and hearing about the NHS clinics and his thoughts on the landscape of the gambling industry. Thanks once again to him for talking so openly and sharing his knowledge and insight. As always, plenty of takeaways from the conversation. The fantastic treatment the NHS clinics provide, not only to the problem gambler, but also to affected family members. How he sees a huge amount of potential in people with a gambling disorder, and how there is hope that you can beat this addiction and turn your life around for the better. his thoughts on the normalisation of gambling to young people. For example, removing gambling sports sponsorships similar to the removal of tobacco sponsorships. And not forgetting all the people that have lost their lives to gambling addiction, and especially supporting the fantastic work of Gambling with Lives, a charity set up by bereaved families and friends of loved ones who've taken their own lives from gambling-related suicide. So far in the series, we've heard from former gamblers, Darren and George, and their experiences. We've heard from Katie at GamStop and how to put controls in place to stop gambling. And now we've just spoken to Matt to find out about the NHS treatment available in this country. But it would be great to hear from an industry insider, to hear their point of view on problem gambling. Let's find out in the next episode of the Invisible Addiction podcast, when I speak to Richard Flint, the former CEO of Sky Bet.